then sound. Before the picture even comes up, you hear it, a combine running hard, that deep mechanical roar of a big machine working at full capacity, cutting through a heavy crop on a warm September morning. It is not a gentle sound. It is not background noise. It is the sound of serious horsepower doing serious work, and it fills the entire frame before a single image appears. Then the picture comes, a wide aerial shot, the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, early fall. The mountains in the distance still holding their summer green, but the fields below already turning, corn standing tall and ready, hay cut and rowed. The kind of landscape that looks like it was designed specifically to test a machine's limits. Rolling ground, tight field corners, heavy tonnage per acre, and a harvest window that doesn't wait for anyone. The camera drops lower, follows a fence line, crosses a gravel road, and there, working a field of field corn on the eastern edge of a 1,200-acre operation, is a New Holland CR10 combine, fully loaded, header wide, moving at a pace that looks almost casual from the air, but when you get down to ground level is anything but. This machine is not struggling. It is not laboring. It is simply working, steady, powerful, and completely unbothered by the weight of the crop it is processing. Pull back, let the machine shrink into the landscape. Let the scale of the operation become clear. This is not a hobby farm. This is not a weekend operation. This is a working commercial farm that has been in the same family for 3 generations, and every single acre of it has a cost attached to it. Every bushel has a number. Every hour of downtime has a consequence. And the machine working that field today almost wasn't here. Because 2 years before this shot was taken, someone stood in a dealer's showroom 40 minutes from this valley and told the man who owns this farm that a New Holland combine couldn't handle his operation. He said it with confidence. He said it with a brochure in his hand and a smile on his face. He said it like he was doing the farmer a favor. He was not doing him a favor. This is the story of what that conversation cost and who paid for it. The farm is called Aldermore. It sits between Woodstock and Edinburgh in Shenandoah County, Virginia. The Aldermore land was first farmed by the Granger family in the late 1940s, started by a man named Harold Granger, who came home from the Pacific with 2 things: a Purple Heart and an absolute determination to never work for anyone else again. Harold started with 200 acres and a used tractor that needed more work than he did. By the time his son Dale took over in the mid-1970s, the operation had grown to 600 acres. Dale added hay and forage to the corn and small grain mix. He understood that in the Shenandoah Valley, the soil and the climate gave you options, and a smart farmer used all of them. By the time Dale's son Curtis took the operation into the 21st century, Aldermore had grown again, 1,200 acres, a mix of corn, winter wheat, alfalfa, and orchard grass hay, custom hay baling work for neighboring farms on the side, a small herd of beef cattle that used the forage the fields couldn't sell commercially. Curtis Granger is not a man who makes impulsive decisions. He is not the kind of farmer who buys on emotion or changes equipment brands because a salesman shook his hand firmly. He is methodical, financially disciplined, and deeply familiar with the machinery that keeps his operation alive. He had run the same combine brand for nearly 2 decades. It had served him adequately, not brilliantly, not without problems, but adequately. When the machine aged past the point of economical repair, Curtis began the process he always began. He researched, he asked questions, he ran numbers, and at some point during that process, a New Holland CR10 entered the conversation. The CR10. Let's be clear about what this machine is. At the time Curtis was shopping, the CR10 represented New Holland's flagship combine, twin-rotor design, the same fundamental architecture that New Holland had spent decades refining into one of the most efficient threshing and separating systems in the industry. The CR10 offered over 600 horsepower, grain tank capacity that could handle serious acreage without constant unloading stops, throughput capacity that, on paper, matched or exceeded anything else in its class. On paper, it was exactly what a 1,200-acre mixed grain and forage operation needed. Curtis knew this. He had done his research. He had talked to other farmers running CR10s in similar terrain. He had looked at the fuel consumption numbers, the throughput data, the service interval requirements. He had done what a serious farmer does before spending several $100,000 on a single piece of equipment. He was not walking into that dealership blind. But the dealership Curtis walked into was not a New Holland dealership. It was a competitor's dealership, a well-established operation that had sold machinery in that part of the valley for decades. The kind of place where the name on the sign carried weight, where the service department had relationships going back generations, and where the sales staff understood that a farmer like Curtis Granger didn't walk through the door very often. The salesman's name is not important. What he said is, Curtis had mentioned the CR10, had mentioned that he was seriously considering it, that the specs looked strong, that a few farmers he respected were running them without complaint. He asked the salesman directly, was there a reason he shouldn't consider New Holland for his operation? The salesman did not hesitate. He said the CR10 was a fine machine for certain operations. Midwestern flat ground corn country, maybe. Good conditions, straightforward crops, flat terrain. But for what Curtis was running, with the rolling ground of the Shenandoah Valley, with the mix of crops, with the orchard grass and alfalfa in the rotation, he wasn't sure New Holland was really built for that. He said he'd heard reliability concerns from other operators in the region. He said the service network wasn't as strong. He said the resale values were softer. He leaned across the counter and said, "Look, I'm just being straight with you, because I've got your father's business going back years, and I don't want to see you make a mistake." Then he slid a brochure for his own flagship combine across the counter. Curtis looked at it. He looked at the salesman. He asked a few more questions. The answers all pointed in the same direction. He bought the competitor's machine. The first harvest season with the new combine was, by most measures, acceptable. Not exceptional. Not the step forward Curtis had expected from a new machine running in its prime, but acceptable. There were some calibration issues early in the corn, a sensor problem that cost half a day in late September. The dealer's service truck came out, fixed it, and the season finished without major incident. Curtis logged the downtime. He always logged everything. It was how his father had operated and how his grandfather had operated. Numbers on paper, hours, fuel, yield, downtime, repair costs, everything. Season 1, one significant downtime event. Half a day lost. Cost absorbed. Season filed. He did not panic. New machines have break-in issues. Every farmer knows this. You give a machine a season to prove itself. The second season began to tell a different story. The corn that year was heavy. A strong growing season across the valley had pushed yields to numbers Aldermore hadn't seen in a decade. Good news for the grain check. Complicated news for the combine, because heavy crops stress everything. They stress the threshing elements, the separation system, the cleaning shoe, the engine cooling on long hot days. A machine in its second year, running hard in a heavy crop, tells you what it's actually made of. What Curtis's combine told him was that it was not made of quite enough. The separation losses started climbing in mid-October. He was leaving grain in the field. Not catastrophic amounts, not the kind of loss that makes the evening news, but measurable loss. Loss that showed up when he walked the field behind the combine and saw more than he should on the ground. Loss that translated directly into money he had already planted and grown and harvested and was now leaving in the dirt. He adjusted the settings. He slowed the ground speed. He made every reasonable accommodation. The losses improved marginally. Not enough. Then the rotor issue began. It started as an intermittent vibration, then became a consistent one, then became a problem that required a service call. The dealer came out, diagnosed a rotor concave clearance issue, compounded by wear that, on a machine with fewer than 500 hours, was not what Curtis had expected to see. Parts were ordered, some were in stock, some were not. 3 days. 3 days of the harvest window, during peak conditions, with corn at ideal moisture, sitting in the field, while Curtis waited on parts that were not on a shelf within reasonable distance of Shenandoah County, Virginia. He logged it. He always logged it. 3 days. Estimated yield impact based on moisture gain during the delay. He put a number next to it. It was not a small number. Here is where the story takes the turn that matters. Curtis Granger's neighbor to the north, a man named Paul Whitmore, who ran a similarly sized operation on the far side of the ridge, had bought a New Holland CR10 the same season Curtis had bought his competitor machine. They had both been shopping at roughly the same time. They had even talked about it once, briefly, at the grain elevator in the fall before purchase. Paul had gone with the CR10. Curtis had gone the other direction. Paul's first season had been strong. His second season, that same heavy yield year when Curtis was watching his combine vibrate and waiting on parts, Paul's CR10 had run 14-hour days through the corn without incident. Not one unscheduled stop, not one service call during the harvest window. The twin-rotor system processed that heavy crop like it had been designed specifically for exactly that kind of stress, which in a meaningful sense it had been. Paul's separation losses were low. His fuel consumption per bushel was efficient. His harvest was completed in a window that kept his corn at optimal moisture for the elevator. His check reflected it. Curtis found out the details gradually, not because Paul rubbed it in. Paul was not that kind of man. But in a community that small, in a farming culture that direct, the information moved naturally, at the elevator, at the co-op, at the equipment dealer's service counter when Curtis was there for the third time in one season and Paul walked in for a routine filter order. They didn't have a dramatic conversation about it, but the contrast was visible to everyone watching. Curtis logged that too. He did not write down what he was feeling, because he was not the kind of man who wrote down feelings. But the numbers on that page told the story clearly enough. By the end of the second season, Curtis had a decision to make. He could continue with the machine he had. The dealer had been serviceable, if not exceptional. The machine was still functional, if not performing at the level he needed. He could invest in continued repairs, accept the performance limitations, and absorb the ongoing costs as part of doing business. Or he could look hard at the numbers on those pages and make a different call. Curtis spent the winter going through everything. Every logged hour, every repair invoice, every estimated yield impact from every downtime event, every fuel fill. He put it all on a spreadsheet that his wife helped him format because she was better with spreadsheets than he was, and he knew it. What he saw on that spreadsheet was not a story about a machine that had catastrophically failed. It was a story about a machine that had consistently underperformed, consistently cost more to operate per hour than the projections at purchase had suggested, consistently required more dealer intervention than a machine at that age and hour count should have needed. And when he placed that column of numbers next to the informal information he had gathered about Paul Whitmore's CR10 over the same 2 seasons, the gap was not subtle. It was measurable, consistent, and compounding. Curtis reached out to a New Holland dealer in the region, not the closest one. A dealer he had heard was strong on the service side. He had a conversation that lasted the better part of an afternoon. He brought his spreadsheet. He asked direct questions and expected direct answers. He got them. What he also got in that conversation was a clearer picture of what that original salesman had actually said to him. The reliability concerns he had mentioned, the claims about the service network, the suggestion that New Holland wasn't built for valley conditions. Curtis had taken those statements at face value because the man saying them had decades of relationship with his family, because the showroom felt familiar, because the machine being pushed had a brand name he already knew. He had not verified any of it independently. That was the mistake. Not the machine, exactly. The trust, the willingness to take a competitor's salesman's word for the inadequacy of a rival brand without checking whether any of it was true. Because when Curtis actually looked into it, with 2 years of operational data behind him and a New Holland dealer answering his questions with specifics rather than vague concerns, the picture was different. The CR10's service network in his region was adequate and improving. The resale values, properly contextualized, were competitive. The reliability record, when measured against actual operating data rather than a competitor's verbal characterization of it, was strong. The salesman had not lied exactly. He had shaped the truth. He had emphasized uncertainty where certainty existed. He had manufactured doubt where the evidence didn't support it, and Curtis had let him. That was an expensive lesson. The trade decision involved financial pain. It always does when you move a machine before you intended to. The depreciation hit on the competitor combine, at 2 years old with a mechanical history that any knowledgeable buyer's inspection would surface, was significant. Curtis did not recover full value. He knew going in that he wouldn't. He ran the numbers on the loss and compared it against the projected ongoing cost of continuing with a machine that was already demonstrating a performance and reliability trajectory he did not believe would improve. The math, uncomfortable as it was, pointed one direction. The CR10 arrived at Aldermore in late winter. Curtis and Paul Whitmore spent a morning walking around it together in the equipment shed. Paul pointed out features he had come to appreciate after 2 full seasons. Curtis asked specific questions. Both men were quiet a lot. That is how farmers talk about machinery they respect. They don't get loud about it. Curtis sat in the cab alone for a while, looked at the displays, felt the layout. The previous machine had been familiar in the way anything becomes familiar after 2 years of daily contact. This was different, not worse. Different, more to learn, a different logic to the system. He logged the delivery date and the hour meter reading. 0 hours, new machine, new column on the spreadsheet. The first season with the CR10 coincided with a difficult harvest year across the region. An early fall wet period pushed harvest back and compressed the window. When conditions finally broke in mid-October, every farmer in the valley was trying to get into fields at the same time. Grain moisture was climbing. The pressure to cut and cut fast was real. This is exactly the kind of situation that separates combines. Not the easy seasons, not the ideal conditions, the compromise seasons, the tight windows and the heavy crops and the long days when you cannot afford to stop. Curtis ran the CR10 hard, harder than he had run the previous machine in comparable conditions, because the throughput capacity of the twin rotor system gave him the confidence to push the ground speed. He was moving more crop per hour than he had managed in his best days with the previous combine, and he was doing it with separation losses that stayed within acceptable parameters, even at elevated speeds. The machine ran days that started before first light and ended well after dark. The grain tank held more, which reduced the number of auger wagon cycles and kept the combine in the crop longer. The unloading system was fast enough that even when the cart was there, the stop time was minimal. It did not break down. It did not require a service call. It did not lose a single day to parts delays or sensor faults or rotor vibration. When Curtis walked his cornfields behind the machine on the 3rd day of harvest, looking at the residue left on the ground, he stopped for a moment, crouched down, looked at what was there and what wasn't. The losses were low, lower than he had achieved at comparable ground speeds with the previous machine, even in easier conditions. He stood back up. He didn't say anything. There was no one there to say anything to. He just logged it. Paul Whitmore came over for coffee one morning during a rain delay in the 2nd week of harvest. They sat at the kitchen table with Curtis's spreadsheet open between them. By this point, it was the 3rd season of data for Paul and the 1st for Curtis. The comparison was becoming clearer with each page. Paul's CR10 had now covered 3 full Aldermore scale harvests. The reliability record was not spotless, because no machine's record is spotless at that workload. There had been one significant issue, a sensor fault in the cleaning system late in Paul's 2nd year, which had cost 4 hours. 4 hours. That was his worst single downtime event across 3 seasons. Curtis's previous machine had cost him more than that in a single September afternoon. They talked about the service experience. Paul had developed a strong relationship with his New Holland dealer. The parts availability had improved year over year, as the dealer had stocked more CR10 specific inventory based on regional demand. The service technicians knew the machine. When Paul called, they sent someone who had worked on CR10 specifically, not a generalist who was figuring it out alongside him. Curtis had experienced something similar in his 1st season with the CR10. The dealer relationship had developed faster than he expected. Part of that was Curtis's own reputation as an organized, data-driven operator. Part of it was that the dealer recognized a serious commercial farm when they saw one and treated it accordingly. The conversation turned, as it inevitably does between men of that age and experience, to what might have been. not dramatically, not with anger, just the quiet acknowledgement between two farmers who had made different decisions at the same moment and had watched those decisions compound over time. Curtis said, simply, that he should have verified what he was told instead of accepting it. Paul said nothing for a moment. Then he said that the salesman had probably believed what he was saying, at least partly, that people selling one thing often genuinely convince themselves the other thing is inferior, that it's easier than outright lying. Curtis considered that. Then he said it didn't really matter whether the man believed it or not. The outcome was the same. That was the end of the conversation on the subject. By the end of Curtis's second full season running the CR10, the financial picture had clarified to a degree that required no interpretation. The fuel cost per bushel harvested was down compared to the previous machine's average across its 2 operational seasons. This was partly machine efficiency and partly the improved throughput, allowing more bushels to be processed in the same number of hours. Either way, the number moved in the right direction. The downtime cost was dramatically lower. This was the single largest line item improvement. The previous machine had cost Curtis, in logged downtime hours during harvest windows and associated yield and moisture penalties, a figure that represented a meaningful percentage of his annual grain revenue across 2 seasons. The CR10's downtime in its first 2 seasons at Aldermore was a fraction of that. The maintenance cost was running slightly above the dealer's projected figures, not unusually so for the operational intensity Curtis applied, but within a range that the original purchase economics had accounted for. The resale value projection, when Curtis had the machine professionally appraised at the 2-year mark for insurance purposes, came in stronger than the competitor machine had appraised at the same age. The CR10 held value. This was not a trivial consideration for an operation that eventually needed to think about the next trade cycle. Curtis did not broadcast any of this. He was not the type. He updated his spreadsheet. He filed his seasons. He talked to his bank and his accountant and his wife with the numbers. Those were the conversations that mattered. But the valley is not a large place, and farmers talk, and what they talk about most honestly is equipment and money, because those are the 2 things that determine whether the operation survives to the next generation. The story of Aldermore and the CR10 moved through those conversations the way true stories do in farming communities. Without fanfare, without drama, just information passed from one serious farmer to another about what had actually happened when a machine was tested at full commercial scale across multiple seasons in real conditions. There is a footnote to this story that belongs here because it is part of what happened. The original competitor combine that Curtis had traded away went to a dealer auction. It sold. Not for what Curtis had hoped, but it sold. The buyer was a smaller operation, a part-time farmer with fewer acres, someone for whom the machine's known mechanical history was less consequential because the workload would be lower. At that same auction, a few rows over in the equipment lot, a late-model New Holland hay tool from Aldermore was also going through. Curtis had upgraded the hay side of his operation the previous spring. The New Holland tool had solid hours and a clean service history and sold strong. The auctioneer moved between the 2 pieces without knowing the connection. The crowd at a farm auction never knows all the stories behind the iron. But Curtis knew. He stood at the edge of the lot with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched both machines sell. He didn't talk to anyone. He didn't make a show of anything. He just watched and then walked back to his truck. The CR10 is still running at Aldermore. It has now covered enough seasons to have moved from new purchase anxiety into operational familiarity. Curtis knows the machine now, the way a farmer knows any piece of equipment he has run hard across multiple harvests. He knows what sounds normal and what doesn't. He knows how it handles different moisture levels in the corn. He knows how the twin rotor system behaves in heavy orchard grass hay residue mixed into the rotation. The spreadsheet is thick now. Multiple seasons of data in columns that compare cleanly. Paul Whitmore's CR10 continues to operate on the other side of the ridge. The 2 machines have run parallel stories across adjacent operations for several years now, and the stories they tell are consistent. Strong throughput, manageable maintenance, reliable harvest windows. Year over year, the numbers justify the choice. Curtis's son has started spending time in the cab, third generation learning a machine that the fourth generation may one day rely on. There is something in that continuity that the Granger family has always understood. The machines you choose are not just a single season's decision. They compound. They define what an operation can accomplish across years. Harold Granger chose his first equipment based on what he could afford and what was available. Dale Granger chose based on brand relationships that had been established before he was born. Curtis Granger chose, the first time, based on a salesman's characterization of a competitor's product. He will not make that mistake again. The next major equipment decision at Aldermore will be made the same way the CR10 ultimately was. Operational data, direct questions, verified answers. The brand name on the competitor's brochure will not be a factor. The salesman's confidence will not be a factor. The numbers will be the factor. They always should have been. The aerial shot again. Wide. The Shenandoah Valley in early morning fall light, mountains blue in the distance, fields below in every stage of harvest readiness. Beautiful country. Hard country. The kind of land that doesn't reward bad decisions with a second chance. The CR10 is moving through the corn in the lower field. You can see it from altitude, a red and yellow machine against tan stalks, working steadily through a long straight run toward the field end. No drama in the image, no struggle visible, just a machine doing what it was built to do at the scale it was built to do it. This is not a dramatic image. It is not supposed to be. Drama is what happens when equipment fails during harvest. Drama is parts delays and moisture penalties and yield losses logged on a spreadsheet that grows heavier every year. Drama is the moment a farmer realizes he trusted the wrong source of information and is sitting on the financial consequences of that trust. This image is what happens after the drama is over, after the decision has been corrected, after the numbers have been run and the machine has been tested and the spreadsheet has been updated enough times that the truth is no longer in any doubt. A New Holland CR10 working a Virginia harvest field in good conditions. That is what the right decision looks like. That is what it sounds like. That is what it costs to learn the difference between a salesman's story and a machine's record. And somewhere in a dealership 40 minutes from this valley, a brochure for a competitor combined sits in a display rack by the showroom door. The salesman who handed one to Curtis Granger is probably still behind the same counter, probably still leaning across it to tell a farmer about reliability concerns he has heard, probably still sliding his own brochure across the polished surface with the practiced confidence of a man who has done it 100 times. What he does not know, or perhaps does not want to know, is that some of the farmers who left that showroom and took his advice have since done their own math. And the math does not agree with him. It never did.